Hey folks, this evening we kick off with a genuine tale that's sure to linger in your thoughts. In 1140, a talented educator called Peter Abelard faced castration at the hands of his student's uncle for the audacity of falling in love with her. What's even more astonishing? She decided to cherish him for the remainder of her days. What if I revealed that medieval legal documents record numerous individuals who faced execution merely for wedding someone their relatives opposed? And here's the part that's truly mind-boggling. Some of the most fervent love correspondence in all of history originated from individuals barred from ever being in each other's presence again. Before we plunge into these remarkable real accounts, here's something that would truly brighten my evening. If this sends shivers down your spine, and I assure you it will, press that subscribe button and give it a thumbs up. But what I'm genuinely interested in is this. What hour is it in your location right now? Are you snuggled up in bed in California? Perhaps it's time for morning tea in London. Share your time zone in the comments, as I adore the idea that we're connecting over these narratives from all corners of the globe. Now, let's lower the lights, settle in, and journey back to an era when loving someone could genuinely endanger your entire existence. Envision this. It's the year 1200, and love isn't an option, it's an offense. Not in a figurative sense, but quite literally. In medieval Europe, prioritizing your emotions over your kin's desires might result in being cut off from inheritance, banished, or something far worse. The data from preserved legal papers is utterly staggering. Scholars examining countless medieval texts uncovered that unsanctioned unions led to catastrophic outcomes for nearly everyone affected. Here's what utterly astounded me upon discovering it. People in the Middle Ages didn't merely hazard social awkwardness for affection. They gambled their whole world, their loved ones, their prospects, occasionally their very lives. And still, they pursued it repeatedly, prompting you to ponder what sort of affection could justify such tremendous peril. Allow me to sketch a scenario that will make your contemporary relationship issues appear charming. You're 14 years old, and yes, that age was deemed suitable for matrimony, and your guardians have just declared your betrothal to a complete stranger. Perhaps they're double your age. Perhaps they reside leagues away. Perhaps they don't share your tongue. But here's the aspect that would stun us now. Rejection wasn't truly feasible. This had nothing to do with suitability or joy. Matrimony was commerce, straightforward and unadorned. The Catholic Church, which governed almost every facet of everyday existence, held precise notions regarding affection and wedlock. They instructed that matrimony served mainly to forge partnerships and generate rightful descendants. St. Augustine, among the Church's key thinkers, penned that intense affection, even among wedded pairs, might pose a spiritual threat, since it diverted focus from devotion to God. Consider it this way. Suppose every amorous choice you made required endorsement from a committee more concerned with commercial ties than your inner peace. That was basically medieval matrimony. Your emotions were viewed as an indulgence that the majority simply couldn't indulge in. Yet, this is where the human spirit displays its wonderful defiance. The greater the prohibition on something, the stronger the yearning for it becomes. Contemporary psychology terms this reactance theory. When restrictions are imposed on us, our longing for the restricted item actually heightens. Medieval folks didn't grasp the scientific explanation, but they certainly experienced the outcomes. The societal hierarchy added further layers of difficulty. If you belonged to the peasantry, which encompassed roughly 90% of the population, and you developed feelings for a member of the aristocracy, that wasn't merely unsuitable ambition. It was perceived as a challenge to the divine arrangement established by God. Historical accounts detail harsh penalties for those bold enough to affection beyond their rank. Political unions generated their unique brand of sorrow. Royal daughters and noble women were basically tools for negotiation, employed to solidify pacts, avert conflicts, or merge estates. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most influential females of the medieval era, was wedded as an adolescent to cement political bonds. She subsequently expressed feeling like a pawn on a chessboard instead of an individual with personal aspirations. Religious existence posed a distinct obstacle altogether. Monks and nuns pledged chastity, vowing to forsake all romantic ties in dedication to God. However, monastic houses were frequently populated by the era's most learned and captivating individuals. Documents from diverse religious establishments indicate that upholding these pledges wasn't always straightforward, and affectionate bonds did form, frequently resulting in controversy and discipline. For those drawn to individuals of the same gender, the circumstances were even riskier. The Church deemed such bonds immoral, and secular laws often mandated severe repercussions. Nevertheless, researchers have uncovered proof of same-sex bonds that individuals sustained covertly, at times for decades. Now, here's the captivating element. All these constraints didn't extinguish romance. They elevated it to something nearly legendary. When affection turns prohibited, it turns epic. Medieval individuals devised remarkably inventive methods to convey their emotions. They crafted concealed signals, wove secret notes into verse, and established intricate wooing practices that could mask genuine fervor beneath socially permissible conduct. Certain paramours exchanged messages via emblematic floral displays, where various flowers conveyed particular sentiments. Others employed acrostic verse, where the initial character of each verse formed their sweetheart's name. Some invented fictitious commercial ties simply to justify exchanging letters. It resembled a clandestine dialect of affection that coexisted with everyday society. The paradox is exquisite. A culture that exerted such effort to regulate affection inadvertently produced some of the most ardent, lasting romantic narratives in human records. These illicit romances laid the groundwork for all we deem romantic in the present day. The notion of affection triumphing over everything, of fervor meriting any forfeit, of two spirits uniting against formidable challenges, every amorous film you've adored, every ballad that's evoked goosebumps, every narrative about genuine affection surmounting hurdles. They all originate from these medieval insurgents who confronted a society declaring, "You must not love," and resolved to love regardless. And that leads us to the most renowned, most fervent, and most sorrowful of all these prohibited medieval affection tales. It commences in the scholarly core of Paris, where the era's brightest intellects assembled to learn and discuss. Notre Dame Cathedral was still being built, and the city pulsed with fresh concepts about philosophy, theology, and the essence of humanity. This is where Peter Abelard, regarded as one of the finest educators and thinkers of his time, was on the verge of encountering a pupil whose wit equaled his. Her name was Heloise. She was the niece of a prominent church figure, and she was poised to enter a romantic saga so profound, so notorious, and so heartbreaking that folks are still discussing it almost 900 years on. Their narrative encompasses it all. Brilliant intellects developing affection, a clandestine wedding, familial treachery, savage retribution, compelled parting, and affectionate missives so exquisite they're still examined today. But most startling of all, what befell Abelard was so vicious that it altered both their existences eternally and somehow fortified their affection even further. But that remarkable narrative is where we commence next time with two of the era's most brilliant individuals, realizing that occasionally the most exceptional minds foster the most perilous affections. So here we stand in the silhouette of medieval Paris, where the atmosphere itself appeared to spark with scholarly vigor. The year is 1115. And if you strolled through the slender lanes near Notre Dame, still merely a building site then, you'd overhear the most intriguing discussions resounding from small chambers where the planet's sharpest intellects congregated to contend about matters ranging from God's nature to the enigmas of human logic. In one of those chambers resided a man who was quite literally altering how folks reasoned. Peter Abelard wasn't merely any instructor. He was a superstar of medieval scholarship. Pupils journeyed vast distances simply to listen to his teachings. Monarchs solicited his counsel. The church both dreaded and venerated his scholarly might. At 36, he was attractive, magnetic, and fully conscious of his own genius. Some historians portray him as possessing what we'd now term an enormous ego, but truthfully, he earned it. Abelard possessed this astonishing ability to simplify the most intricate philosophical inquiries. He scrutinized everything church teachings, ancient sages, even his own mentors. In a society where most simply embraced what was conveyed to them, Abelard ventured to inquire, but why? And that lone query was transforming learning across Europe. But here's where our narrative veers in a direction that no one, not even the astute Abelard, anticipated. Canon Fulbert, one of the most esteemed church authorities in Paris, faced a dilemma. His 17-year-old niece, Heloise, was excessively intelligent for her own benefit, and in medieval times that was truly hazardous for a female. She could read and write in Latin, French, and Hebrew, tongues that most males couldn't command. She consumed philosophical works, composed verse that brought seasoned academics to tears, and had this bothersome tendency to pose queries that rendered church authorities profoundly uneasy. Fulbert required someone intelligent enough to stimulate her intellect and reputable enough that her unorthodox schooling wouldn't provoke scandal, someone who could direct her perilous wit into suitable paths. And there was truly only one individual in all of Paris who matched that profile: Peter Abelard. So Fulbert extended to Abelard a proposal that appeared ideal for all parties. Come reside in our home, tutor Heloise one-on-one, and in return you'll incur no housing costs and gain entry to the premier private collection in Paris. For a scholar like Abelard, this was basically striking the medieval jackpot. But here's what Fulbert remained unaware of, and what Abelard would later admit in his compositions. The eminent philosopher harbored a hidden agenda. He'd learned of this exceptional young lady, and he was intrigued, not merely on an intellectual level. He was captivated by the notion of a female whose intellect could rival his. Their initial session occurred on a brisk fall morning in 1115. Abelard later documented this instant with a precision that still evokes shivers. He recounted entering Fulbert's library and beholding Heloise for the first time. Not her attractiveness, which period accounts describe as exceptional, but her gaze. He noted that her eyes possessed a type of wisdom that appeared to penetrate everything, including him. They started with Aristotle, progressed to Augustine, debated the essence of universals and the dilemma of evil. But what began as scholarly dialogue swiftly turned into something far more perilous. These weren't simply tutor and pupil. These were two of their generation's most brilliant minds uncovering that scholarly rapport could be the most exhilarating type of allure conceivable. Abelard later confessed that he started fabricating reasons to prolong their sessions. Heloise, in turn, began posing progressively intricate queries that demanded lengthier clarifications. Their philosophical arguments evolved into literary exchanges, which became private dialogues, which became something neither had foreseen or readied for. The splendor of their bond was that it originated in their intellects before it ever reached their emotions. In a society where most unions were orchestrated without the pair ever engaging in substantial conversation, here were two individuals who fell for each other's ideas first. But they were engaging in an extraordinarily hazardous pursuit, and both recognized it. Abelard was intended to serve as Heloise's instructor and moral mentor. She was the cherished niece of a potent church authority. He was a man who'd taken unofficial vows of chastity to advance his scholarly path. She was anticipated to either wed someone selected by her uncle or join a convent. What transpired next is chronicled in their own correspondence, which endured because it's regarded as some of the most exquisite love letters penned in any language. As winter transitioned to spring in 1116, their scholarly allure became sentimental, then corporeal. Abelard noted that their tutorials increasingly served as pretexts to be together. Their discussions shifted to topics about everything except their true sentiments. And then arrived the instant that altered all. During what was meant to be a deliberation on Plato's concept of love, and I vow this irony is genuine, Heloise gazed at Abelard and posed a query that bore no relation to philosophy and every relation to how he was regarding her. Abelard later recorded that in that instant, all his rational barriers collapsed. Here was someone who comprehended not merely his concepts, but his essence. Someone who could test him, motivate him, and make him sense that his intellect had at last discovered its ideal counterpart. They became paramours in secrecy, convening in that library, encircled by ages of insight on affection, fervor, and the human spirit. But here's what renders their narrative even more exceptional. Their scholarly bond never waned. Even as their connection grew physical, they persisted in contesting each other's notions, composing verse together, debating philosophy with the same fervor they applied to all else. For almost a year, they succeeded in concealing their bond. Abelard would appear for sessions, Fulbert would welcome him cordially, and then depart them alone with their volumes and their perilous secret. From an external view, all seemed entirely proper, just a brilliant tutor and his outstanding pupil delving into existence's grand inquiries. Secrets of such magnitude tend to unveil themselves, and when this specific secret burst forth, it would shatter existences, terminate professions, and forge one of history's most tragic romantic narratives. The conclusion commenced, as such matters frequently do, with the most ordinary outcome imaginable. In late 1117, Heloise discovered she was expecting. Just envision the dread of that moment. Here's a young female whose whole future hinged on her standing, bearing the offspring of a man meant to be her moral guide. Here's a scholar whose vocation would be ruined if anyone learned he'd violated his unofficial chastity vows. And here's a potent church authority who would be completely disgraced if this controversy went public. But what ensued next discloses something lovely about both Abelard and Heloise. Rather than alarm, rather than seeking some method to conceal their bond, they made a decision that illustrates precisely who they were. They selected affection. They selected one another. They selected to confront whatever repercussions arose from that decision. Abelard covertly wed Heloise in a modest rite outside Paris. It wasn't legitimate in the Church's view, because he was supposed to remain celibate, and it wasn't socially tolerable because she was meant to wed someone of her uncle's selection. But they exchanged vows to each other regardless, making commitments they would honor for their lifetimes. And that's where our narrative shifts toward something so savage, so medieval, and so jarring that it transformed both their lives eternally. Because Uncle Fulbert had at last uncovered what was occurring in his residence, and his response was going to be rapid, violent, and utterly medieval in its brutality. But the most astonishing aspect, even after all that was about to befall them, even after the brutality and the enforced parting and the total ruin of the existence they'd envisioned together, their romantic narrative was merely commencing. Because occasionally, the greatest romantic narratives aren't about individuals who get to remain together. They're about individuals who decide to cherish each other regardless, no matter what the world attempts to do to halt them. What Fulbert inflicted on Abelard on that dreadful night in 1118 was going to test that affection in manners that would have demolished most individuals. But Heloise and Abelard weren't most individuals. They were about to demonstrate that when two souls genuinely acknowledge each other, not even the most ruthless medieval justice can separate them. The night that altered everything started like any other. It was a chilly spring evening in 1118, and Abelard was slumbering in his lodgings near the cathedral school, likely dreaming about philosophy or his secret spouse, entirely oblivious that Canon Fulbert had finally assembled the pieces of what was transpiring under his own roof. You must comprehend, Fulbert wasn't merely furious, he was profoundly humiliated. In medieval culture, a man's dignity was paramount, and Abelard had made him appear foolish before all of Paris. The esteemed church authority who couldn't even safeguard his own niece's virtue. The respected canon who'd been so gullible that he'd literally welcomed the predator into his home and compensated him for it. What transpired next exposes something alarming about medieval justice. Fulbert didn't merely seek vengeance. He desired to set an example that would resound through the ages. He aimed to ensure that no man would ever dare to disgrace a family again. So Fulbert did something that was both lawful and utterly appalling. He employed a band of men to invade Abelard's chamber in the dead of night. What they did to him was termed fair retribution under medieval law. But by contemporary measures, it would be regarded as one of the most ruthless acts of reprisal conceivable. They castrated him. Let me halt for a second because I realize that's a startling thing to learn, even 900 years on. But this wasn't arbitrary brutality. This was deliberate medieval justice. By depriving Abelard of his manhood, Fulbert was issuing a declaration that would be comprehended by all in their society. The penalty aligned with the transgression. The man who had employed his masculine authority to entice an innocent girl would no longer possess that authority. Abelard endured, but scarcely. Medieval medical practices were essentially speculation, and the fact that he survived this ferocious assault was deemed miraculous. but enduring was merely the start of his trial. Because in medieval culture, a castrated man wasn't merely physically reduced, he was socially obliterated. Consider it. Abelard had constructed his whole identity around his scholarly brilliance and his masculine allure. He was the instructor that pupils traveled vast distances to hear, the thinker who could debate anyone and prevail, the man who'd captivated the most intelligent woman in Paris. Abruptly, he was none of those things. He was flawed merchandise in a society that had no room for flawed men. The news disseminated through Paris like wildfire. Within days, everyone knew what had befallen the great Peter Abelard. Some murmured that it was heavenly justice for violating his vows. Others claimed it was a calamity that such a brilliant intellect had been ruined by one instant of frailty. But all concurred on one matter. His profession was finished. Here's what shatters my heart about this narrative. Abelard's primary worry wasn't for himself. It was for Heloise. In the letters he composed later, he depicted lying in that bed, shattered and hemorrhaging, fretting not about his own prospects, but about what this controversy would inflict on the woman he adored. Because while he would recuperate and eventually reconstruct some sort of existence, her standing was demolished forever. In medieval culture, a female entangled in a controversy like this had essentially no alternatives. She couldn't wed anyone respectable because everyone knew she'd been tarnished. She couldn't re-enter normal society because the disgrace would trail her everywhere. Her sole option was to vanish behind convent barriers and devote the rest of her days to religious atonement. But here's where Heloise displayed the fortitude that would render her legendary. When Abelard dispatched word that she should join a convent to safeguard what remained of her standing, her reply was exceptional. She wrote back, and these are her genuine words that endured in the monastery archives: "I would rather be your mistress than another man's wife." Can you fathom the bravery it required to pen those words in 1118? In a culture where females were expected to be quiet, compliant, and ashamed of their sensuality, Heloise basically declared, "I regret nothing. I selected love, and I would select it again." But she also grasped the reality of their predicament. Their secret wedding signified nothing now. No one would acknowledge it, and Abelard's state made it unfeasible anyway. Their son, whom they'd named Astrolabe after a scientific tool because they were intellectuals even in their selection of infant names, would need to be reared by Abelard's kin in secrecy. So Heloise made the most heart-wrenching decision conceivable. She consented to take vows as a nun, not because she sensed a vocation for religious life, but because it was the only means to shield the man she cherished from additional scandal. She would forfeit her liberty, her prospects, and any opportunity for happiness to preserve what was left of Abelard's standing. The day she took her vows at the convent of Argenteuil was one of the most dramatic scenes in medieval history. According to witnesses, Heloise stood before the altar and recited the traditional vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. But as she spoke the words that would bind her to religious life forever, tears streamed down her face, not tears of religious joy, but tears of grief for the life she was giving up. Abelard, meanwhile, made his own dramatic choice. Unable to continue as a secular teacher after the scandal, he became a monk at the Abbey of Saint-Denis. But his letters reveal that he didn't choose religious life out of calling. He chose it out of shame and desperation. He wrote that he felt like a dead man walking, going through the motions of monastic life, while his heart remained with the woman he could never see again. And that's where most tragic love stories would end, with the lovers separated forever, their dreams destroyed, their future stolen by the cruelty of the world around them. But Heloise and Abelard's story was just beginning a new chapter, one that would prove their love was stronger than physical separation, more enduring than social scandal, and more passionate than most people who get to spend their whole lives together. Because here's what their enemies didn't understand. When you take two brilliant minds that have recognized each other as soulmates and force them apart, you don't kill their love. You transform it into something almost supernatural. They began writing letters, not just any letters, but correspondence so beautiful, so intellectually rich, and so emotionally honest that they're still studied in universities today as the pinnacle of medieval literature. These weren't just love letters, they were philosophical treatises, theological debates, and emotional confessions all rolled into one. Heloise wrote to Abelard about her struggles with religious life, admitting that she performed her duties as a nun while her heart remained completely secular. She questioned church doctrine, challenged religious authority, and described her ongoing passion for a man she was supposed to have forgotten. Her letters reveal a woman of extraordinary honesty and intellectual courage. Abelard responded with equal emotional intensity, but also with the guilt and self-recrimination that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He blamed himself not just for what had happened to him, but for what had happened to her. He wrote that he would gladly suffer his punishment again if it meant she could have had a different life. But here's the most remarkable thing about their correspondence. It wasn't just about looking backward at what they had lost. They continued to challenge each other intellectually, to debate theology and philosophy, to grow and learn together despite being physically apart. The love had evolved beyond the physical into something that distance couldn't touch. The letters were copied and shared throughout medieval Europe, becoming legendary even during their lifetimes. Other lovers read them for inspiration. Scholars studied them for their theological insights. Even church officials who officially disapproved of their relationship secretly admired the beauty of their writing. And that brings us to someone who would challenge everything we think we know about medieval love, power, and the choices women could make in a world designed to control them. Because while Heloise and Abelard were writing their hearts out from behind monastery walls, there was another woman who was rewriting the rules entirely. Her name was Eleanor of Aquitaine, and she was about to prove that sometimes the most powerful love story is the one where a woman refuses to let anyone else choose her destiny. Now, imagine being the most powerful woman in Europe before you turn 25. That was Eleanor of Aquitaine's reality. And trust me, she made the most of it in ways that scandalized the entire medieval world. Born in 1122, Eleanor inherited the Duchy of Aquitaine when she was just 15 years old, making her the wealthiest unmarried woman in Europe virtually overnight. We're talking about lands that stretched from the Loire River to the Pyrenees, basically a third of modern-day France. In today's terms, she was like a teenage billionaire with her own army, and everyone, absolutely everyone, wanted to marry her. But here's what makes Eleanor's story so fascinating. She didn't just accept being treated like a prize to be won. From the very beginning, she made it clear that she intended to have a say in her own life, her own marriages, and yes, her own love affairs. And in a world where women were supposed to be seen and not heard, Eleanor's voice was about to echo through history. Her first marriage was arranged before she could object. At 15, she was married to Louis VII of France, making her Queen of France while she was still practically a child. Now, Louis was a decent enough guy, devout, well-meaning, and completely overwhelmed by having a wife who was smarter, wealthier, and infinitely more charismatic than he was. Contemporary chronicles describe Louis as the kind of man who would have been perfectly happy as a monk. He was deeply religious, preferred prayer to politics, and had absolutely no idea what to do with a wife who had strong opinions about everything from military strategy to church reform. Eleanor, meanwhile, was bursting with energy, ambition, and ideas that her pious husband found both fascinating and terrifying. Their marriage lasted 15 years, and by all accounts it was a study in fundamental incompatibility. Eleanor wanted adventure, intellectual stimulation, and passionate love. Louis wanted peace, quiet, and a wife who would pray with him instead of challenging papal authority at dinner parties. It's almost comical how mismatched they were, like pairing a racehorse with a meditation teacher. But the real problem wasn't personality differences. The real problem was that after 15 years of marriage, Eleanor had given Louis only 2 daughters, no male heir, and in medieval politics, that was a catastrophe. The French court began whispering that maybe God was displeased with their union. Maybe the marriage was cursed. Maybe it was time for Louis to find a new wife who could give him sons. Eleanor, being Eleanor, had a different interpretation. She decided that the problem wasn't divine displeasure. The problem was that she had married the wrong man. And in 1152, she did something that shocked the entire medieval world. She divorced the King of France. Now, divorce in the 12th century wasn't like divorce today. You couldn't just file papers and split your assets. You had to prove that your marriage had never been valid in the first place, usually by claiming some distant blood relation that violated church law. Eleanor managed to get her marriage annulled on the grounds that she and Louis were related within the prohibited degree. Basically, they were distant cousins, which was technically against canon law, but had been conveniently overlooked when the marriage was politically useful. But here's the part that made everyone's jaw drop. Eleanor negotiated to keep all her lands, all of them. She walked away from her marriage to the King of France with her wealth, her titles, and her independence intact. In a world where divorced women usually ended up in convents with nothing, Eleanor essentially pulled off the greatest prenup in medieval history. And then just 8 weeks after her divorce was finalized, she did something that sent shockwaves through every royal court in Europe. She married Henry Plantagenet, who was 11 years younger than her, dashingly handsome, and about to become King Henry II of England. The speed of this marriage was scandalous enough, but the choice of husband was pure genius. Henry wasn't just young and attractive, he was ambitious, intelligent, and powerful enough to protect Eleanor's independence while being secure enough not to be threatened by her strength. Plus, and this is where it gets deliciously complicated, marrying Henry meant that Eleanor's vast French territories would now belong to the English crown, making her ex-husband Louis's life extremely difficult. Medieval chroniclers had no idea what to make of Eleanor and Henry's relationship. Some called it a political alliance disguised as romance. Others whispered that it was pure physical attraction between 2 of the most charismatic people of their age. But Eleanor's own letters, the few that survived, suggest something even more interesting. She'd found her intellectual and emotional equal. Henry II was known for his explosive temper, his boundless energy, and his habit of wearing out multiple horses in a single day because he couldn't sit still. Eleanor matched him in every way. Where Louis had been overwhelmed by her personality, Henry was energized by it. They debated politics, planned military campaigns together, and created what was essentially a medieval power couple. Their marriage produced 8 children, including the future King Richard the Lionheart and King John of Magna Carta fame. But more importantly, it created a partnership that redefined what was possible for women in positions of power. Eleanor didn't just marry Henry, she actively ruled alongside him, making decisions about everything from legal reform to international diplomacy. But here's where Eleanor's story gets even more remarkable. In 1173, when she was 51 years old and had been married to Henry for 21 years, she did something that would have been unthinkable for any other medieval woman. She led a revolt against her own husband. Henry had been having very public affairs, including one with a woman named Rosamond Clifford, who he'd installed in a palace and showered with gifts that should have gone to his queen. Eleanor had tolerated his infidelities for years, but when Henry began making decisions about their son's inheritance without consulting her, she'd had enough. So Eleanor organized her sons into a rebellion against their father. She personally traveled through Aquitaine, raising armies and securing alliances. Contemporary accounts describe her riding at the head of troops, wearing armor, and giving speeches that inspired fierce loyalty. At 51, she was literally leading a medieval feminist revolution disguised as a family feud. The rebellion failed, and Henry had Eleanor imprisoned for the next 16 years. But even in captivity, she remained a force to be reckoned with. She continued to influence politics through secret correspondence, maintained loyalty among her supporters, and waited for her chance to reclaim her power. When Henry died in 1189, Eleanor was released by her son Richard, who immediately recognized that he needed his mother's political expertise. At 67, an age when most medieval women were considered ancient, Eleanor embarked on the most adventurous period of her life. She traveled across Europe arranging marriages, negotiating treaties, and at one point personally journeyed to Sicily to escort her granddaughter to Spain for a royal wedding. But perhaps the most telling story about Eleanor comes from the very end of her life. When she was nearly 80 years old, she learned that her grandson, Prince Arthur, was being threatened by King John. Despite her advanced age, Eleanor personally led a military campaign to protect the boy, besieging a castle and negotiating his release through sheer force of personality. Eleanor's approach to love was revolutionary because she insisted on being an equal partner in all her relationships. She refused to be a passive recipient of male protection or decisions. She loved passionately, but on her own terms. And when love disappointed her, she didn't retreat into wounded silence. She took action to change her circumstances. What makes Eleanor's story so modern is that she understood something that many people today are still learning. Love and power don't have to be mutually exclusive. You can be passionate and political, romantic and strategic, vulnerable and strong. Eleanor's court in Aquitaine became the birthplace of something that would change romantic culture forever, the tradition of courtly love. But what most people don't know about courtly love is that it was essentially an elaborate game where knights would fall in love with married women they could never have, creating some of the most passionate and impossible relationships in medieval history. Welcome to the most bizarre dating system ever invented by human beings. Seriously, if you think modern relationships are complicated, wait until you hear about courtly love, a medieval tradition so strange, so elaborate, and so completely backwards that it makes reality TV look straightforward. Eleanor's court at Poitiers in the 1170s was like a medieval think tank for romance, where the most creative minds of the age gathered to essentially ask, what if we made love as complicated and impossible as humanly imaginable? And the answer they came up with was courtly love, a system where the whole point was to fall desperately in love with someone you could never ever have. Here's how it worked, and I promise you're going to think I'm making this up. A knight would choose a married noble woman, usually someone significantly above his social station, and declare himself her devoted servant. Not her lover, mind you, her servant. He would then spend years, sometimes decades, performing elaborate acts of devotion to prove his worth, knowing full well that his love would never be consummated. The rules were incredibly specific, almost like a medieval dating app with the world's most frustrating terms of service. Andreas Capellanus, who wrote The Art of Courtly Love around 1184, laid out 31 official rules that included gems like, marriage is no real excuse for not loving. No one can be bound by a double love. And my personal favorite, a true lover is constantly and without intermission possessed by the thought of his beloved. Think about that for a moment. They created a system where being miserable was the whole point, where unrequited love wasn't a bug, it was a feature. Where the greatest romantic achievement was to love someone so purely that you never even tried to win them. But here's what makes courtly love fascinating rather than just masochistic. It was actually a form of emotional and intellectual rebellion disguised as entertainment. In a world where marriages were business arrangements and women had no choice in their romantic destinies, courtly love created a space where emotions could be explored, where women could hold power over men, and where love could exist purely for its own sake. Let me tell you about Chrétien de Troyes, one of the most famous courtly love poets who wrote for Eleanor's court. His stories about knights like Lancelot weren't just entertainment, they were revolutionary propaganda. In his tales, the greatest knights in the world would abandon honor, duty, and common sense for love. Lancelot literally walked across a sword bridge to reach Guinevere, choosing love over his own safety. In a society that valued masculine strength and military prowess above all else, these stories suggested that emotional vulnerability might actually be the highest form of courage. The women in these relationships held unprecedented power. A knight's lady could demand anything of him, that he fight in tournaments wearing her colors, that he write her poetry, that he undertake dangerous quests just to prove his devotion. Marie de Champagne, Eleanor's daughter, reportedly held courts of love where noble women would hear cases about romantic disputes and render judgments about proper courtly behavior. But here's where it gets really interesting. Some of these relationships, despite all the rules about impossibility and purity, became genuinely passionate affairs that lasted for decades. Take the case of Ulrich von Liechtenstein, a German knight who fell in love with a married noble woman and spent 30 years writing songs about her, fighting in tournaments for her honor, and performing increasingly elaborate stunts to win her attention. Von Liechtenstein's autobiography, written in the 1250s, reads like a medieval romantic comedy. He once disguised himself as the goddess Venus and traveled across Europe, challenging other knights to joust in her honor. He cut off his own finger and sent it to his lady in a jeweled box as a Valentine's gift, which she apparently returned with a note saying she wasn't impressed. He learned to play musical instruments, write poetry in 3 languages, and even underwent what was essentially medieval plastic surgery to make his hair lip less noticeable, all in the hopes of winning her approval. The most remarkable part, she never left her husband for him. They never ran away together. They maintained their impossible relationship for 3 decades with Ulrich, perpetually hoping, and his lady perpetually maintaining just enough distance to keep him devoted, and both of them seemed to find this arrangement not just tolerable, but deeply meaningful. Modern psychologists studying courtly love relationships have identified something fascinating. Many of these partnerships provided emotional intimacy that was completely absent from most medieval marriages. While married couples often barely knew each other and certainly didn't share their deepest thoughts, courtly lovers engaged in profound emotional and intellectual connections. They shared poetry, discussed philosophy, and created bonds that were often deeper than many legal marriages. But the most famous courtly love affair in history had to be the relationship between Dante Alighieri and Beatrice Portinari. Dante first saw Beatrice when they were both 9 years old, fell instantly in love, and spent the rest of his life writing about her. He spoke to her exactly twice in his entire life, literally 2 conversations, and yet she became the inspiration for the Divine Comedy, one of the greatest works of literature ever written. Beatrice married someone else, had children, and died young, never knowing that a man she'd barely spoken to was creating immortal art in her honor. Dante married someone else too, but continued to write about Beatrice as his spiritual guide and perfect love. Their relationship existed almost entirely in his imagination. Yet, it produced poetry that people still read with tears in their eyes 700 years later. The courtly love tradition also created some of the most beautiful and bizarre romantic customs in history. Knights would wear tokens from their ladies, a scarf, a glove, sometimes even underwear into battle as symbols of their devotion. They would fast on holy days dedicated to their beloved. Some would take vows to perform a certain number of good deeds or charitable acts in their lady's honor. There are records of knights who built elaborate gardens and commissioned artwork dedicated to women who barely acknowledged their existence. One German nobleman spent a fortune creating a mechanical clock that played a different love song every hour, all composed for a woman who was married to his political rival. But perhaps the strangest aspect of courtly love was how it influenced actual marriages. Eleanor's own granddaughter, Blanche of Castile, used courtly love traditions to completely redefine her relationship with her husband, Louis VIII of France. Instead of accepting the typical distant formal royal marriage, she insisted that Louis court her as if she were an unattainable lady. They wrote each other love poetry, exchanged romantic gifts, and maintained the rituals of courtly love even after 20 years of marriage and 8 children. The tradition spread throughout Europe, creating a culture where romantic expression became an art form. Courts competed to host the most elaborate romantic festivals. Nobles commissioned love songs like we might commission wedding photographers. The entire concept of romantic chivalry opening doors, sending flowers, writing love letters, traces back to these medieval attempts to make love both impossible and eternal. And that brings us to perhaps the most heartbreaking example of courtly love put into practice: the real-life Romeo and Juliet stories that inspired Shakespeare centuries later. Because while courtly love was supposed to remain purely theoretical, some people took it to its logical conclusion, choosing death over life without their impossible beloved. These weren't fictional tragedies. They were real people who loved so completely that they made the ultimate sacrifice, creating stories so powerful that we're still telling them today. There's something you need to know about Romeo and Juliet. Shakespeare didn't invent that story. He borrowed it from real medieval lovers whose tragedies were so devastating, so emotionally powerful, that people had been retelling them for centuries before the bard ever put quill to paper. The most haunting of these true stories comes from 13th century Verona. Yes, the same Verona where Shakespeare would eventually set his play. But this wasn't fiction. This was the documented tragedy of Mariotto and Giannozza, whose love affair was recorded in the chronicles of Frate Guido Bulieri in 1281, nearly 300 years before Shakespeare was born. Mariotto was a young nobleman from a prominent Veronese family, and Giannozza was the daughter of his family's bitter political rivals. Sound familiar? In medieval Italian city-states, family feuds weren't just personal drama, they were literally matters of life and death. The Guelphs and Ghibellines had divided Italy into warring factions, and choosing the wrong side could get your entire family exiled or executed. But here's what makes their story even more tragic than Shakespeare's version. Mariotto and Giannozza actually managed to secretly marry. They found a sympathetic friar who performed the ceremony in a hidden chapel outside the city walls. For 3 months they maintained their impossible love affair, meeting in secret, sharing stolen moments, and believing they could somehow make their love work, despite the hatred between their families. Then, Mariotto killed Giannozza's cousin in a street fight. It wasn't planned, it wasn't premeditated, it was just the kind of sudden violence that erupted constantly between feuding families. But the result was catastrophic. Mariotto was banished from Verona immediately, and Giannozza's family, not knowing about the secret marriage, announced her engagement to a wealthy merchant from Florence. What happened next reads like the most heartbreaking love letter ever written. Giannozza sent a message to Mariotto through the same friar who had married them, begging him to return for her. She wrote, and these words survived in the monastery records, "I would rather die as your wife than live as another man's bride. If you love me as you have sworn, you will find a way to save me from this fate worse than death." Mariotto's response was immediate and desperate. He began the dangerous journey back to Verona, knowing that if he was caught within the city walls, he would be executed on sight. But love made him willing to risk everything. He disguised himself as a pilgrim, traveled mostly at night, and managed to reach the outskirts of Verona just as Giannozza's wedding preparations were beginning. But here's where their story takes a turn that's somehow even more tragic than Romeo and Juliet. Giannozza had convinced the same friar to give her a sleeping potion that would make her appear dead, allowing her to escape the arranged marriage and flee with Mariotto. The plan was simple: fake her death. Have Mariotto rescue her from the tomb and escape together to start a new life somewhere far from their feuding families. The potion worked perfectly. Giannozza appeared to die suddenly, and her family, grief-stricken, prepared for her burial. But the message telling Mariotto that her death was fake never reached him. A messenger was intercepted by rival family guards, and Mariotto learned of Giannozza's death from a stranger who had no idea about their secret plan. What Mariotto did next shows you the kind of love that medieval people were capable of. Instead of fleeing to safety, instead of accepting that fate had defeated them, he broke into the family tomb where Giannozza was laid out in her wedding dress, apparently dead. The records from the City Watch describe finding Mariotto's body the next morning, slumped over Giannozza's tomb, an empty vial of poison in his hand. He had chosen to die rather than live without her. But the most heartbreaking detail, Giannozza's body was found beside his, and she'd clearly awakened from the sleeping potion. The evidence suggested that she had woken up, found Mariotto dead beside her, and taken the same poison that had killed him. They died within hours of each other, victims of a communication failure that would have been tragic in any century, but was absolutely devastating in an age before reliable messaging systems. But their story doesn't end with their deaths. The discovery of their bodies, along with the love letters found in Mariotto's possession, revealed their secret marriage to both families. The shock of realizing that their children had died for love and that their family feud had destroyed two innocent lives led to something unprecedented. The first recorded peace treaty between feuding Italian noble families. The Baldi Chronicle records that both families, overwhelmed by grief and guilt, agreed to end their generations-long conflict. They established a joint charitable foundation in Mariotto and Giannozza's memory, and their story became a cautionary tale that spread throughout northern Italy about the cost of family hatred. But they weren't the only real-life Romeo and Juliet. The medieval period is filled with documented cases of young lovers who chose death over separation. In 1200s France, there was the tragedy of Pierre de Lusignan and Melisande de Tripoli, two young nobles whose families were on opposite sides of a crusader political dispute. When their secret marriage was discovered, Pierre was sent on a dangerous mission to the Holy Land that everyone knew was essentially a death sentence. Melisande died of grief within weeks of his departure, and Pierre, learning of her death, deliberately sought death in battle against overwhelming odds. In England, there's the documented case of William de Roos and Maud de Clare, whose families were feuding over land rights. When their secret relationship was discovered, William was imprisoned in the Tower of London, and Maud was forced into a convent. But Maud refused to take final vows, insisting that she was already married in the eyes of God. When William died in prison after 3 years, Maud starved herself to death rather than accept religious vows that would have meant abandoning her love for him. These stories spread through medieval Europe like wildfire, copied by scribes, retold by traveling minstrels, and adapted into different languages and cultures. The theme was always the same: young love destroyed by family hatred, with lovers choosing death over surrender. What's remarkable is how these real tragedies influenced not just literature, but actual social change. Many medieval communities, after hearing these stories, began implementing formal mechanisms for resolving family feuds before they could escalate to tragedy. Some Italian city-states created love courts where young people could appeal for help when their families opposed their marriages. The church, too, began to change its position on arranged marriages after these highly publicized tragedies. While they couldn't openly oppose family authority, church officials began quietly providing sanctuary for young people fleeing forced marriages. And some progressive theologians argued that marriages without genuine consent were invalid in the eyes of God. But perhaps the most lasting impact of these real-life Romeo and Juliet stories was how they changed the way people thought about love itself. Before these tragedies, romantic love was often seen as a luxury or an entertainment. After these stories spread, love began to be seen as a force so powerful that it could inspire the ultimate sacrifice, so sacred that dying for it was considered noble rather than foolish. The medieval chroniclers who recorded these stories weren't just preserving tragic news. They were documenting a shift in human consciousness about what love could be and what it was worth. And this brings us to something that might surprise you. While these cross-family love stories were capturing everyone's imagination, there was an entirely different kind of forbidden love happening that was even more dangerous, even more hidden, and in many ways, even more revolutionary. Because the medieval period wasn't just about noble families feuding over politics. It was also a time when the very boundaries of what constituted acceptable love were being challenged in ways that would have made even Eleanor of Aquitaine nervous. Let me tell you about a love story that was so scandalous, so impossible, and so dangerous that the people involved had to create entirely new identities just to survive it. This is about cross-class romance in medieval Europe, where falling in love with someone outside your social rank wasn't just frowned upon. It was considered an attack on the natural order of the universe itself. Medieval society was built on what they called the Great Chain of Being, a cosmic hierarchy that placed everyone in their proper place from God at the top down to peasants at the bottom. Moving up or down this chain wasn't just socially unacceptable, it was literally considered sinful. The Church taught that God himself had arranged society into different levels, and trying to love above or below your station was like trying to argue with divine will. But here's what the Church and the nobility didn't count on. Human hearts don't care about cosmic hierarchies. The most extraordinary example comes from 13th century England, documented in the court records of King Edward I. Lady Margaret de Clare was one of the wealthiest women in England, cousin to the king himself, owner of vast estates across Wales and the Welsh Marches. She was expected to marry within the highest nobility, probably a foreign prince or at least an earl with substantial political connections. Instead, she fell in love with her groom. Not a metaphorical groom, an actual groom, a man named Thomas who took care of her horses, mucked out stables, and earned about as much in a year as Margaret spent on a single dinner party. In terms of social distance, it would be like a modern billionaire falling in love with someone who cleaned their stables. Except in medieval times, the consequences were infinitely more severe. What makes Margaret's story remarkable is that we know so much about it because of the elaborate legal proceedings that followed. When their secret marriage was discovered in 1290, it created a crisis that went all the way up to the king. The marriage was considered so outrageous that it threatened the stability of the entire social system. But here's the part that gives me chills. Margaret and Thomas had been secretly married for 3 years before anyone found out. 3 years of Margaret pretending to be considering various noble suitors while actually living as the wife of a man who was by all social standards completely beneath her notice. The court records reveal how they managed it. Margaret would send Thomas on errands to her various estates and then travel separately to meet him. They had created an entire network of servants and minor clergy who helped maintain their secret. Margaret even had a fake seal made so that Thomas could send her official correspondence that wouldn't arouse suspicion. When the truth came out, the reaction was swift and brutal. King Edward declared their marriage invalid and ordered Thomas imprisoned for corrupting a woman of noble blood. But Margaret did something that shocked the entire medieval world. She refused to renounce her husband. Standing before a court of bishops and nobles, Margaret de Clare looked the king himself in the eye and said, and this is recorded in the official court transcript, I chose love over station, my heart over my heritage, and I would make the same choice again, even knowing the cost. For a woman to speak to the king that way was unprecedented. For a noble woman to defend her marriage to a servant was revolutionary. The punishment was severe. Margaret was stripped of most of her lands and titles, and Thomas was exiled from England permanently. But here's what's beautiful about their story. They went into exile together. Margaret chose poverty and scandal over wealth and respectability, and they lived the rest of their lives as commoners in France, reportedly happier than most nobles who married for political advantage. But cross-class romance wasn't always about noble women marrying down. Sometimes it was about people rising so far above their birth that they could challenge the system entirely. Take the case of Jacques Coeur, who started as the son of a furrier in the French town of Bourges and became one of the wealthiest men in Europe through trade and banking. In 1444, Jacques fell in love with Agnès Sorel, who was not only far above his original station, but was also the official mistress of King Charles VII of France. By all rights, a merchant's son shouldn't even have been able to speak to the king's favorite, let alone court her. But Jacques had become so wealthy and powerful that he could essentially buy his way into the highest levels of society. Their relationship was a perfect example of how love could completely upset medieval social calculations. Here was a woman who was technically of noble birth, but whose position depended entirely on royal favor, and a man who was technically a commoner, but who controlled more wealth than most dukes. Neither of them fit neatly into the traditional social hierarchy. So, they created their own rules. The affair between Jacques and Agnes lasted for nearly 5 years and produced some of the most beautiful love poetry of the medieval period. Jacques commissioned artists to create illuminated manuscripts filled with coded love messages. And Agnes reportedly wore jewelry that spelled out his name in precious stones arranged in specific patterns. But this story also reveals the deadly politics of cross-class love. When Agnes died suddenly in 1450, Jacques was immediately accused of poisoning her. Not because there was any evidence, but because the idea of a merchant's son having a relationship with the king's mistress was so threatening to the established order that people needed to believe it had ended in betrayal. Jacques was convicted in absentia and fled to Rome, where he spent the rest of his life in exile. Modern historians have found no evidence that he was guilty of anything except loving above his station, but in medieval terms that was crime enough. Perhaps the most touching cross-class love story comes from the records of a German monastery in the 1200s. Brother Friedrich was a monk from a noble family who had taken religious vows, and Anna was a peasant woman who worked in the monastery kitchens. They fell in love over conversations about theology. Apparently, Anna was largely illiterate, but had an extraordinary natural intelligence that fascinated the educated monk. Their relationship lasted for over a decade without being discovered, partly because religious life provided perfect cover for their meetings. Friedrich would accidentally visit the kitchens when he needed to discuss monastery business, and Anna would find excuses to deliver meals to the scriptorium, where Friedrich worked on illuminated manuscripts. But what makes their story unique is that they never tried to leave the monastery or abandon their respective roles. Instead, They created a relationship that existed entirely within the constraints of their impossible situation. Friedrich taught Anna to read Latin by carving letters into wooden scraps that she could study while working. Anna shared her knowledge of herbal medicines and folk wisdom, which Friedrich incorporated into his theological writings. When their relationship was finally discovered, the abbot faced an unprecedented situation. Friedrich was from a family that had donated heavily to the monastery, and Anna was considered irreplaceable because of her skills in managing the kitchen and herb garden. Instead of the usual punishment of expulsion and excommunication, the abbot made an extraordinary decision. He allowed them to continue their relationship, but only under strict religious supervision. Friedrich and Anna were permitted to meet once weekly in the presence of the abbot, where they could discuss theology and share their intellectual connection, but any physical relationship was strictly forbidden. They maintained this arrangement for over 20 years, creating what was essentially the medieval equivalent of a supervised intellectual romance. Their weekly conversations were recorded by monastery scribes and reveal a relationship of extraordinary depth and tenderness. They discussed everything from the nature of divine love to practical questions about growing medicinal herbs. Friedrich wrote that Anna had taught him more about God's presence in daily life than all his theological education. And Anna reportedly said that Friedrich had shown her that learning could be a form of worship. What's remarkable about all these cross-class love stories is how they forced medieval society to confront the contradictions in their own social system. If God had truly arranged society into fixed hierarchies, why did love keep crossing those boundaries? If noble blood was truly superior, why were commoners sometimes more worthy of love than princes? These relationships didn't just challenge social norms, they changed them. By the end of the medieval period, the idea that love could transcend social boundaries had become so accepted that it was influencing actual marriage law. Some regions began allowing marriages between different social classes as long as both parties could prove their love was genuine rather than motivated by money or social climbing. But even as cross-class romance was becoming more accepted, there was another form of forbidden love that remained absolutely taboo, hidden so deeply in medieval society that most people never suspected it existed. These were relationships that challenged not just social boundaries, but the very definitions of acceptable human connection love affairs that were conducted in the shadows of monasteries, in the coded language of religious texts, and behind the veils of lives that appeared perfectly conventional to the outside world. Here's a truth that will completely change how you think about medieval Europe. Some of the most passionate, enduring, and beautifully documented love stories from this period were between people of the same gender. And I'm not talking about speculation or reading between the lines. I'm talking about explicit love letters, sworn partnerships, and relationships that lasted decades, all hidden in plain sight within the very institutions that officially condemned such love. The medieval church's position on same-sex relationships was clear and brutal. Such love was not just sinful, it was worthy of death. The penalty for what they called sodomy was typically burning at the stake, and even accusations without proof could destroy lives entirely. So how did same-sex couples not just survive but sometimes thrive in such a hostile environment? They got creative, incredibly, brilliantly, daringly creative. Let me tell you about two women whose love story reads like a medieval heist thriller. Benedetta Carlini and Bartolomea Crivelli were nuns at a convent in Pescia, Italy in the early 1600s. Now, I know that's technically past our medieval time frame, but their story was built on techniques that same-sex couples had been using for centuries. And the documentation is so extraordinary that it gives us a window into how these relationships actually worked. Benedetta was the abbess of the convent, a position of enormous power and responsibility. Bartolomea was a younger nun under her spiritual guidance. To the outside world, they appeared to have a perfectly appropriate mentor-student relationship. But the convent records discovered in the 1980s by historian Judith Brown revealed something extraordinary. They had been lovers for over a decade. How did they manage it? Benedetta claimed to have mystical visions that required private spiritual counseling with Bartolomea. She convinced the other nuns that God was speaking to her through dreams and trances, and that these divine communications needed to be interpreted in absolute privacy. For 10 years, their spiritual consultations provided perfect cover for their relationship. The genius of their method was that it used the system's own rules against itself. Religious mysticism was highly valued in medieval and early modern Christianity, so no one questioned why an abbess would need private time to discuss divine revelations. They created a legitimate religious excuse for behavior that would have gotten them executed if discovered. But their story gets even more fascinating when their relationship was finally investigated in 1619. The church officials found evidence of an elaborate fantasy life that Benedetta had created to justify their physical relationship. She claimed that during her mystical trances, she was possessed by the spirit of a male angel named Splenditello, and that it was this male spirit, not Benedetta herself, who made love to Bartolomea. Think about the psychological sophistication of this defense. In a world where same-sex relationships were unthinkable, Benedetta created a theological loophole that allowed their love to exist within approved religious categories. She essentially argued that their physical relationship was heterosexual because she was temporarily inhabited by a male spirit. The church investigators were completely baffled. They had clear evidence of a sexual relationship between two women, but it was wrapped in such complex theological claims that they couldn't figure out how to prosecute it. Benedetta was eventually removed from her position, but she was never executed or even formally charged with sodomy. Male same-sex relationships required different strategies to survive, but they were equally creative. The tradition of sworn brotherhood provided perfect cover for romantic partnerships between men. These were formal ceremonies often performed in churches where two men would swear lifelong loyalty to each other in front of witnesses. The brilliant historian John Boswell documented hundreds of these ceremonies from medieval church records, and many of them use language that is unmistakably romantic. Partners promised to love each other more than any earthly thing, to share all worldly goods, and to never be separated in life or death. Some ceremonies even included the exchange of rings and the sharing of communion wine from the same cup. The most documented case comes from 12th century Constantinople, where Callistos and Akakios went through a sworn brotherhood ceremony that was recorded in extraordinary detail. The church record describes them as united in soul and body, and notes that they shared a single bed and a single table for the remainder of their lives. They were buried in the same tomb with an inscription that reads, "Here lie two men who loved each other as Christ loved the church." Modern scholars debate whether these relationships were always sexual, but the language used suggests that many certainly were romantic in nature. What's clear is that sworn brotherhood provided a socially acceptable framework for intimate partnerships between men that could last for decades. The most famous example from Western Europe involves Anselm of Canterbury, who later became a saint, and his relationships with various young monks. Anselm's letters to his beloved companions are filled with passionate language that would make modern romance novels blush. To a monk named Gundulf, he wrote, "I yearn for you with my whole heart. I long to see your face and hear your voice, for I am sick with love for you." Now, the Church has always insisted that Anselm's relationships were purely spiritual, but the language he used was remarkably similar to contemporary love poetry. He wrote about sleepless nights thinking of his beloved, about physical longing, and about emotional devotion that surpassed all other earthly attachments. What's fascinating is that Anselm's passionate friendships were not only tolerated, but celebrated by his contemporaries. He became one of the most revered religious figures of his age, suggesting that the medieval church was more flexible about same-sex emotional intimacy than we might expect, as long as it was framed in acceptable religious terms. But perhaps the most ingenious solution to the problem of same-sex love was the tradition of gender-bending saints and religious figures. Medieval Christianity was filled with stories of women who disguised themselves as men to join monasteries and men who adopted feminine religious roles. These stories provided models for people whose gender identity or romantic inclinations didn't fit conventional categories. The most famous example is Saint Marinus, who was actually a woman named Marina, who lived as a male monk for her entire adult life. Marina fell in love with another monk. They maintained a romantic relationship for over 20 years, with Marina's true gender remaining secret until after her death. When her identity was revealed, instead of being condemned, she was declared a saint for her devotion to religious life. These gender-bending saints weren't just fictional characters. They were often based on real people who had found ways to live authentic lives within the constraints of their society. The fact that their stories were preserved and celebrated suggests that medieval people were more accepting of gender and sexual diversity than official church doctrine would suggest. The survival strategies used by same-sex couples in medieval times were remarkably sophisticated. They created support networks within religious communities, developed coded languages for expressing their feelings, and found ways to live together openly while maintaining plausible explanations for their relationships. Some male couples became business partners, sharing households and financial resources in ways that looked perfectly normal to outsiders. Some women entered convents together where they could live in the same community for their entire lives without anyone questioning their intense friendship. Some people adopted opposite-gender religious personas that allowed them to express their true identity within acceptable spiritual frameworks. What's most remarkable is that many of these relationships were not just tolerated, but celebrated within their communities. Medieval people seemed to understand that love could take many forms, and as long as those forms could be expressed within socially acceptable frameworks, they were often embraced rather than condemned. These hidden love stories reveal something beautiful about human resilience and creativity. When love is forbidden, people don't stop loving. They just get better at hiding it, protecting it, and finding ways to make it survive in hostile environments. And that brings us to perhaps the most complex and dangerous form of forbidden love in medieval times: relationships that crossed not just social boundaries or gender expectations, but religious ones as well. Because while Christian Europe was officially at war with Muslim Spain and the Holy Land, individual hearts were creating connections that transcended the greatest ideological divide of the medieval world. Imagine loving someone so deeply that you're willing to risk not just your life, but your eternal soul. That was the reality for people who fell in love across religious boundaries in medieval Europe, where interfaith romance wasn't just socially unacceptable. It was considered heresy, punishable by excommunication, exile, or death. The medieval world was defined by religious conflict. The Crusades had been raging for centuries. Christian armies were fighting Muslim forces in Spain, and the Church taught that followers of different faiths were literally enemies of God. In this context, falling in love with someone from another religion wasn't just crossing a social line, it was crossing into enemy territory. But here's what makes these stories so extraordinary. They happened anyway. And some of the most passionate, most documented, and most influential love stories of the medieval period were between Christians, Muslims, and Jews who chose love over the deepest divisions of their time. The most famous example comes from 12th century Al-Andalus, the region of Muslim Spain that was a remarkable melting pot of Christian, Muslim, and Jewish cultures. This is where we find the love story of Diego López de Haro, a Christian knight from northern Spain, and Zaida, a Muslim princess from Seville. Diego was supposed to be fighting Muslims, not falling in love with them. He was part of the Christian Reconquista, the centuries-long campaign to drive Muslim rulers out of Spain. But when he was captured during a raid in 1086 and brought to Seville as a prisoner, something unexpected happened. He met Zaida, daughter of the Muslim king Al-Mutamid, and their attraction was immediate and overwhelming. What makes their story remarkable is that we have documentation from both Christian and Muslim sources, giving us a rare glimpse into how interfaith romance was viewed from different perspectives. The Christian chronicles describe Diego as a noble knight who was bewitched by Saracen beauty, while the Muslim accounts speak of Zaida as a princess who lost her reason to Christian charms. The relationship began as a typical captor-captive dynamic, but quickly evolved into something much deeper. Zaida spoke Arabic, Latin, and the Romance vernacular that would become Spanish. Diego was educated in theology and philosophy. They spent hours in conversation debating religion, philosophy, and the nature of love itself. The Christian chronicler Ibn Hayyan records that Diego told Zaida he would convert to Islam if she would marry him. But Zaida, in a response that shows remarkable theological sophistication, reportedly said, "I will not ask you to abandon your God for me, because a man who would betray his faith for love might someday betray love for something else." Instead, they created something unprecedented, a relationship that honored both their religious traditions. Diego remained Christian, Zaida remained Muslim, but they found ways to share their spiritual lives without compromising their core beliefs. They would pray at the same times, facing different directions. They studied each other's religious texts. They created rituals that incorporated elements from both faiths. For 3 years, this impossible relationship flourished in secret. Diego was technically still a prisoner, but he lived more like a guest in the palace. Zaida arranged for him to have his own quarters, access to books, and freedom to move throughout the city. To outside observers, He appeared to be a valuable hostage being treated well for political reasons. But their story takes a heartbreaking turn that illustrates exactly why interfaith love was so dangerous. In 1089, Christian forces launched a major offensive against Seville. Diego was faced with an impossible choice: warn his beloved and her family about the impending attack, or remain loyal to his Christian compatriots who were planning to destroy everything she held dear. Diego chose love over loyalty. He warned Zaida's father about the Christian battle plans, allowing the Muslim forces to prepare an effective defense. The Christian attack failed, but Diego's betrayal was discovered. He was declared a traitor by his own people and could never return to Christian lands. But the Muslim court also became suspicious of Diego's loyalties. If he could betray Christians for love, might he not also betray Muslims for some other reason? The very act that proved his devotion to Zaida also made him an outsider in both communities. The solution they found was as creative as it was desperate. Diego and Zaida fled together to the borderlands between Christian and Muslim territories where they lived as traders and interpreters. Their knowledge of both cultures and languages made them valuable to merchants and diplomats who needed to cross religious boundaries for business. For over a decade, they lived in this liminal space between worlds, belonging fully to neither, but creating their own unique life together. Their children were raised to understand both Christian and Muslim traditions, and some of the earliest examples of truly multicultural education in medieval Europe came from families like theirs. But perhaps the most remarkable interfaith love story comes from the First Crusade itself, documented in multiple chronicle sources. Robert of Normandy, one of the leaders of the Crusade, fell in love with a Muslim woman named Kerboga during the siege of Antioch in 1098. This relationship was scandalous beyond belief. Robert was literally leading a holy war against Islam, and Kerboga was the daughter of the Muslim commander defending the city. Their love affair began during a temporary truce and continued even as their respective armies were fighting around them. The Crusade Chronicles describe secret meetings between Robert and Kerboga in a ruined church between the two armies. They would meet at dawn before the day's fighting began and discuss everything except the war that was tearing their worlds apart. Robert taught Kerboga Latin poetry, and she taught him Arabic calligraphy. What makes their story even more extraordinary is that both sides knew about the relationship and for different reasons allowed it to continue. The Christian leaders hoped that Robert's relationship with Kerboga might provide intelligence about Muslim battle plans. The Muslim defenders thought that Kerboga might be able to influence Robert to make strategic mistakes. Both sides were wrong. Robert and Kerboga maintained their relationship without betraying military secrets to each other. They created a space of pure personal connection that existed independently of the political and military conflict surrounding them. When Antioch finally fell to the Crusaders, Kerboga disappeared. Some sources suggest she fled to Damascus. Others claim she disguised herself as a Christian pilgrim and followed the crusade to Jerusalem. Robert spent the rest of his life searching for her, eventually abandoning the crusade entirely to pursue rumors of her whereabouts throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The Jewish experience of interfaith love in medieval Europe was particularly complex because Jews were often caught between Christian and Muslim conflicts while maintaining their own distinct religious identity. The most documented case comes from 13th century Cordoba involving Abraham ibn Ezra, a Jewish scholar, and Maria de Leon, a Christian noblewoman who had converted from Islam. Their relationship illustrates the incredible complexity of interfaith romance in medieval Spain, where religious identity was often fluid and conversion was sometimes a matter of survival rather than conviction. Abraham was a renowned philosopher and poet whose work was respected by Christian, Muslim, and Jewish intellectuals. Maria had been born Muslim, converted to Christianity when her family fled political persecution, and was exploring Jewish philosophy when she met Abraham. Their intellectual connection evolved into romantic love, but they faced opposition from all three religious communities. Christians viewed Abraham with suspicion because of his Jewish faith. Muslims considered Maria a traitor for her conversion to Christianity, and many Jews were uncomfortable with Abraham's relationship with a woman who had been born into another faith. The solution they found was remarkable for its theological sophistication. They argued that their love transcended religious boundaries because it was fundamentally spiritual in nature. They claimed that God had brought them together, not despite their different backgrounds, but because of them. Their relationship was a living example of how divine love could unite rather than divide. Abraham wrote a treatise, still preserved in medieval manuscripts, arguing that interfaith love could be a form of worship when it led to greater understanding between communities. Maria learned Hebrew and contributed to Jewish philosophical discussions while maintaining her Christian identity. Their relationship lasted until Maria's death in 1240. And Abraham's grief was expressed in some of the most beautiful interfaith love poetry of the medieval period. He wrote verses that incorporated Christian, Muslim, and Jewish imagery, creating a new form of religious expression that honored all three traditions. What's remarkable about all these interfaith love stories is how they forced medieval society to confront the contradictions in their own religious teachings. If love was a gift from God, why should it be constrained by human religious boundaries? If different faiths all claim to worship the same divine source, why couldn't that common ground be the foundation for human connection? These relationships didn't just challenge religious authority, they created new forms of spirituality that were more inclusive and more complex than traditional Orthodox teachings. The children of interfaith couples often became bridges between communities, serving as translators, diplomats, and cultural ambassadors who could navigate multiple religious worlds. But even as some interfaith couples were finding ways to build bridges between religious communities, there was another form of forbidden love that challenged the very foundations of medieval society. Relationships that existed within the walls of religious institutions themselves, where spiritual authority met human desire in ways that would scandalize the entire Christian world. What I'm about to tell you sounds like medieval gossip, but it's actually documented history. Some of the most scandalous, most passionate, and most politically explosive love affairs in medieval Europe happened between people who had sworn sacred vows of celibacy. And I'm not talking about isolated incidents. I'm talking about systematic patterns of forbidden romance within the very institutions that were supposed to be examples of spiritual purity. The medieval church was built on a foundation of celibacy. Priests, monks, nuns, and higher church officials all took vows promising to renounce earthly love in service to God. But here's what the church didn't anticipate. Putting passionate, intelligent people together in enclosed communities and telling them they couldn't fall in love was like creating a pressure cooker for romantic drama. The most explosive example comes from the Abbey of Fontevraud in 12th century France, which was unique because it was a double monastery housing both monks and nuns under the authority of an abbess. This arrangement was supposed to demonstrate that spiritual love could transcend gender differences. Instead, it became the setting for one of the most documented love scandals in medieval history. Abbesse Pétronille de Chemillé was one of the most powerful religious women in Europe, ruling over nearly 3,000 monks and nuns across multiple monasteries. She was intelligent, charismatic, and politically connected. Her monastery was the burial place of English royalty, and she regularly advised kings and queens on matters of state. But in 1174, at age 38, she fell in love with Robert d'Arbrissel, the monk who served as her spiritual advisor. What makes their story extraordinary is that we have their actual correspondence preserved in the monastery archives, because their letters were considered too theologically sophisticated to destroy. These weren't simple love letters. They were complex theological treatises that used religious language to express passionate romantic feelings. In one letter, Pétronille wrote to Robert, "You have become the Christ to my Mary Magdalene, and I find in serving you a form of divine worship that surpasses all other prayers." Robert responded, "In loving you, I have found a path to God that no theological study could provide. Your soul calls to mine across the darkness of this earthly existence." The genius of their approach was that they framed their relationship in theological terms that made it difficult for church authorities to condemn. They argued that their love was a form of mystical experience, a direct connection to divine truth that transcended ordinary human relationships. They claimed that their emotional and physical intimacy was actually a form of prayer, a way of experiencing the union between Christ and the Church. For nearly 2 years, their relationship continued openly within the monastery. Other nuns and monks knew what was happening, but the theological complexity of Pétronille and Robert's defense made it impossible for anyone to formally object. How do you accuse someone of sin when they're claiming their actions are a form of worship? The scandal finally erupted when Pétronille became pregnant. There was no way to theologically explain away a baby, and the political implications were enormous. Fontevraud was closely connected to the English royal family, and a pregnant abbess would have created a crisis that could have affected international relations. But what happened next shows you just how much power Pétronille wielded. Instead of being removed from office or excommunicated, she negotiated an extraordinary settlement with church authorities. She agreed to step down as abbess, but only temporarily. She would have her child in secret, arrange for it to be raised by relatives, and then return to religious life with full restoration of her authority. The church agreed to this arrangement because Pétronille's political connections made her too valuable to lose. She returned to power after 18 months and ruled Fontevraud for another 20 years, becoming one of the most influential religious figures of her generation. Robert, meanwhile, was quietly transferred to a monastery in Spain, where he spent the rest of his life writing mystical poetry that many scholars believe was inspired by his relationship with Pétronille. But Fontevraud wasn't the only religious community dealing with forbidden romance. The records from medieval monasteries and convents are filled with evidence of relationships that challenged official church doctrine while somehow managing to survive within religious institutions. At the convent of Saint-Denis in 13th century Paris, the abbess Mahaut de Pougy maintained a 20-year relationship with her confessor, Father Guillaume. What made their relationship particularly scandalous was that Mahaut was from one of the most noble families in France, and Guillaume was a commoner who had risen through church ranks based on his theological brilliance. Their relationship combined multiple forms of forbidden love. It crossed class boundaries, violated religious vows, and challenged the power structure of the church itself. Mahout held ecclesiastical authority over Guillaume as abbess, but he held spiritual authority over her as confessor. Their relationship essentially turned the church's hierarchy upside down. The documentation of their affair comes from the convent's financial records, which show that Mahout consistently used monastery funds to support Guillaume's theological research and to commission artistic works that celebrated their relationship. She funded the creation of illuminated manuscripts that told love stories from classical literature, paid for musical compositions that could be performed during religious services, but contained hidden romantic messages, and even commissioned architectural modifications to the convent that created private spaces where she and Guillaume could meet. What's remarkable is that Mahout's community of nuns not only knew about her relationship, but actively supported it. The convent records show that other nuns helped arrange meetings, carried messages between the lovers, and even lied to church inspectors to protect their abbess' secret. This wasn't just personal loyalty. It was a form of religious rebellion. The nuns at Saint-Denis had created their own interpretation of religious life that valued emotional authenticity over institutional rules. They believed that Mahout's happiness made her a better spiritual leader, and that her relationship with Guillaume enriched the entire community's understanding of love and devotion. But perhaps the most politically explosive religious love affair of the medieval period involved Pope Alexander II's daughter, Lucrezia Borgia, and Cardinal Prospero in the late 15th century. Now, technically, this is past our medieval time frame, but their relationship was built on patterns of papal corruption and religious scandal that had been developing for centuries. Lucrezia was supposed to be the perfect example of reformed religious womanhood, a pope's daughter who had repented of her family's sins and devoted herself to spiritual life. Prospero was one of the most respected theologians in Europe, a cardinal who was considered a possible future pope. Their affair wasn't just a violation of religious vows. It was a symbol of everything that was wrong with the medieval church. But their love letters, which survived because they were too beautifully written to destroy, reveal a relationship of extraordinary intellectual and emotional depth. Prospero wrote to Lucrezia, "In loving you, I have found both heaven and hell. Heaven in the perfection of your soul, hell in the knowledge that our love can never be sanctified by the very institution we serve." Lucrezia responded, "We are living proof that the human heart recognizes no authority higher than love itself. If God is love, as the Church teaches, then our love cannot be sin. It can only be a form of prayer that the world is not yet ready to understand." Their relationship lasted for over a decade and produced some of the most sophisticated theological writing of the Renaissance period. They collaborated on treatises about the nature of divine love, the relationship between spiritual and physical passion, and the possibility of reforming the church from within through authentic spiritual experience. What's fascinating about all these religious love affairs is how they influenced actual church policy over time. The constant scandals involving celibate clergy led to gradual changes in how the church handled these situations. Instead of automatic excommunication, church authorities began developing more nuanced approaches that took into account the political and social implications of each case. Some monasteries began allowing married couples to join religious communities together as long as they maintained celibacy within the monastery walls. Some convents created positions for spiritual advisors who could provide emotional support to nuns without the formal authority that made relationships with confessors so complicated. The Church also began emphasizing different forms of religious devotion that provided outlets for romantic feelings. The cult of courtly love found expression in religious contexts, with monks and nuns writing passionate poetry addressed to Christ or the Virgin Mary that used explicitly romantic language. These institutional changes didn't happen overnight, and they certainly didn't eliminate forbidden romance within religious communities, but they do show how human love consistently challenged and ultimately changed even the most rigid religious institutions of the medieval world. And that brings us to a form of forbidden love that was perhaps even more dangerous than religious scandal political marriages that became passionate affairs, threatening to destroy kingdoms and reshape the map of Europe. Because when royal hearts fell in love with the wrong people, the consequences could literally start wars. Nothing terrified medieval kings more than love. Not war, not plague, not economic collapse love. Because when royalty fell in love with the wrong person, it didn't just threaten personal happiness, it threatened bloodlines, succession laws, international treaties, and the entire political structure of Europe. And yet, some of the most passionate, most documented, and most historically consequential love affairs in medieval history happened within royal families who had everything to lose. The most explosive example comes from 12th century France, where King Philip Augustus fell so completely in love with his third wife, Agnes of Marania, that he was willing to risk excommunication, civil war, and the collapse of the French monarchy just to be with her. What makes this story extraordinary is that Philip was already married twice, and both previous marriages had been purely political arrangements that he had entered into without complaint. But when Philip met Agnes at her father's court in Bavaria in 1196, something unprecedented happened. Here was a king who had spent his entire life making calculated political decisions, suddenly acting like a lovesick teenager. Contemporary chroniclers described Philip as being struck by love as if by lightning, and his behavior became so erratic that his own advisors began questioning his mental state. The problem was that Philip's second wife, Ingeborg of Denmark, was still very much alive and refusing to accept their annulment. Philip had tried to divorce her immediately after their wedding because he found her physically repulsive. Medieval chroniclers delicately describe him as being unable to perform his husbandly duties due to her appearance. But Ingeborg, supported by her brother, the King of Denmark, and backed by the Pope, insisted that their marriage was valid in the eyes of God. So, Philip did something that was both scandalous and legally impossible. He married Agnes anyway, creating a situation where he had two living wives and was technically committing bigamy in defiance of both church and civil law. The Pope responded by placing all of France under interdict, meaning that no religious services could be performed anywhere in the kingdom. No masses, no marriages, no baptisms, no funerals. The entire population of France was essentially cut off from salvation because their king couldn't control his romantic impulses. But here's what makes Philip's story even more remarkable. He didn't care. For 7 years he kept France under papal interdict rather than give up Agnes. He was willing to let his entire kingdom suffer spiritual punishment because his love for Agnes was stronger than his duty as king. Medieval chroniclers described this as the first time in European history that a monarch chose personal happiness over political necessity. The French court during this period was like a real-life medieval soap opera. Philip and Agnes lived openly as husband and wife, had children together, and held elaborate court ceremonies that pretended their marriage was legitimate. Meanwhile, Ingeborg lived in forced seclusion at a French castle, essentially a prisoner in her own kingdom, writing letters to her brother and the Pope, begging for rescue. Agnes, for her part, played her impossible role with remarkable grace. She knew that her marriage was legally invalid, and that she could be abandoned at any moment if political pressures became too great. But she also knew that Philip's love for her was genuine and that she held unprecedented influence over one of the most powerful men in Europe. The contemporary chronicle of Rigord describes Agnes as using her position to advocate for religious reform, charitable works, and more humane treatment of prisoners. She essentially became an unofficial queen who wielded real political power while technically having no legal status whatsoever. It was a precarious position that required extraordinary intelligence and diplomatic skill. The crisis finally ended in 1200 when Agnes died in childbirth. Philip's grief was so overwhelming that he immediately capitulated to papal demands, restored Ingeborg as his legitimate wife, and spent the next decade trying to make amends for the 7 years of interdict. But the damage to his reputation was permanent. Philip Augustus, who should be remembered as one of France's greatest military kings, is instead remembered as the monarch who chose love over duty. But royal forbidden love wasn't always about defying marriage laws. Sometimes it was about falling in love within arranged marriages that were supposed to be purely political. The most famous example is the relationship between King Edward III of England and his Queen Philippa of Hainaut, which began as a typical medieval political alliance and evolved into one of the most passionate royal love stories in European history. Edward and Philippa were betrothed when he was 14 and she was 8 as part of a complex diplomatic arrangement between England, France, and the Low Countries. They met exactly twice before their wedding in 1328, and by all accounts, neither was particularly impressed with the other. Edward was described as a serious, ambitious young man who was focused entirely on military conquest. Philippa was reportedly shy, devoutly religious, and completely unprepared for the political complexities of being Queen of England. But the relationship transformed after the Battle of Crécy in 1346, where Philippa proved herself to be far more than a decorative royal wife. When Scottish forces invaded northern England while Edward was fighting in France, Philippa personally led the English defense. She rode with the army, gave speeches to inspire the troops, and was present at the Battle of Neville's Cross, where the Scottish king was captured. Edward's reaction to news of his wife's military success was unprecedented in medieval royal correspondence. Instead of being concerned about her safety or angry about her assumption of military authority, he wrote to her, "My beloved queen has proven herself more worthy of a crown than I am. In loving you, I have found not just a wife, but a true partner in the greatest adventures of our reign." Their love letters from this period, preserved in the royal archives, reveal a relationship that combined political partnership with genuine romantic passion. They wrote to each other about military strategy, diplomatic negotiations, and the challenges of ruling. But they also shared intimate details about their fears, hopes, and deep emotional connection. What made their relationship revolutionary was that it proved political marriages could become genuine love matches when both partners were willing to see each other as equals. Edward and Philippa ruled England together for nearly 40 years, and their partnership became a model for other royal couples throughout Europe. But perhaps the most tragic example of royal forbidden love comes from the court of Castile, where King Pedro the Cruel fell in love with Maria de Padilla while he was already married to Blanche of Bourbon. This wasn't a case of political marriage versus personal choice. This was a love triangle that literally tore Spain apart and led to one of the bloodiest civil wars in medieval history. Pedro married Blanche in 1353 as part of a French alliance, but he abandoned her immediately after the wedding to return to Maria, whom he had been secretly seeing for over a year. What makes this situation particularly explosive is that Pedro publicly declared that his marriage to Blanche was invalid because he had secretly married Maria first, creating a succession crisis that would haunt Spain for generations. The ensuing civil war lasted for 15 years and involved England, France, and several Italian city-states. Brother fought against brother. Noble families were destroyed, and entire regions of Spain were devastated, all because a king chose personal love over political duty. Pedro eventually died in single combat against his own half-brother, who had been backed by French forces supporting Blanche's claim to legitimacy. But here's what makes Pedro's story more than just a cautionary tale about royal irresponsibility. His relationship with Maria was documented as one of the most passionate and intellectually sophisticated partnerships in medieval history. Maria was not just a royal mistress. She was Pedro's closest political advisor, diplomatic negotiator, and intellectual companion. The letters between Pedro and Maria, preserved in the Castilian royal archives, reveal a couple who saw themselves as partners in creating a new form of monarchy based on personal choice rather than dynastic obligation. They believed that their love was so genuine, so spiritually meaningful, that it superseded legal and political constraints. Maria wrote to Pedro, "We have chosen each other not just as lovers, but as collaborators in reshaping what it means to rule. Our love is not separate from our political vision, it is the foundation of it." Pedro responded, "In loving you, I have found the courage to challenge everything that kings before me have accepted without question. Their political experiment failed catastrophically, but their personal relationship endured even through civil war and international condemnation. When Maria died in 1361, Pedro's grief was so profound that he essentially stopped functioning as a king. He became reckless in battle, made increasingly erratic political decisions, and ultimately sought death as a way to join Maria. What's remarkable about all these royal love stories is how they reveal the impossible tension at the heart of medieval monarchy. Kings and queens were supposed to be above human emotions, making decisions based purely on political calculation and dynastic necessity, but they were also human beings with hearts that couldn't be controlled by law or custom. These royal love affairs didn't just affect individual lives, they changed the course of European history. Wars were fought, alliances were broken, succession laws were rewritten, and entire political systems were restructured because monarchs chose love over duty. And that brings us to something that will completely change how you understand the medieval period, the lasting impact that these forbidden love stories had on European culture, literature, and our modern understanding of romance itself. Because it turns out that many of the ideas we take for granted about love, passion, and individual choice were actually born from these medieval rebels who refused to let society choose their hearts for them. Here's something that will blow your mind. Nearly everything you believe about romantic love, the idea that you should marry for passion, that love conquers all, that individual choice matters more than family approval, that true love is worth any sacrifice, was invented by medieval people who were literally risking their lives to feel these things. We didn't inherit these ideas from ancient Greeks or Romans. We inherited them from medieval lovers who were so determined to follow their hearts that they created an entirely new way of thinking about human relationships. Before the medieval period, love was nice if it happened, but it wasn't considered necessary for a good life. Marriage was about property, politics, and producing legitimate heirs. The idea that two people should choose each other based on emotional connection was not just unusual. It was barely comprehensible to most people throughout human history. But these forbidden medieval love stories changed everything. They didn't just challenge individual relationships, they challenged the entire philosophical foundation of how human beings should live, and the ripple effects of that challenge are still shaping our world today. The most profound impact came through literature. The stories we've been exploring tonight didn't just inspire individual people. They inspired the writers, poets, and artists who created the cultural foundations of Western civilization. Every romantic story you've ever loved, from Shakespeare to modern romance novels to Hollywood movies, traces its DNA back to these medieval rebels who chose love over safety. The influence began with the Troubadours of 12th century France, who took the real-life forbidden love stories happening around them and transformed them into an entirely new form of literature. But here's what's remarkable. They weren't just entertainment, they were propaganda for a revolutionary new way of thinking about human relationships. Chrétien de Troyes, writing in the 1170s, created the Arthurian romances that gave us Lancelot and Guinevere, Tristan and Isolde, and the entire concept of chivalric love. But Chrétien wasn't writing fantasy. He was writing thinly disguised versions of real forbidden love affairs he'd witnessed at Eleanor of Aquitaine's court. The story of Lancelot's impossible love for his king's wife was based on actual knights and ladies who were living similar situations in real life. What made these stories revolutionary was that they presented forbidden love not as sin or weakness, but as the highest form of human experience. In Chrétien's world, the knights who loved most passionately were the most noble, the most worthy, the most blessed by God. He literally turned the medieval moral system upside down, arguing that love was not a distraction from spiritual life. It was spiritual life. This literary revolution had immediate practical consequences. Young people throughout Europe read these stories and began to see their own lives differently. If Lancelot could love Guinevere despite impossible obstacles, if Tristan could choose death over life without Isolde, then perhaps ordinary people could also choose love over duty, passion over practicality. The manuscript evidence shows that these romantic stories spread with incredible speed throughout medieval Europe. By 1200, there were over 300 different versions of the Arthurian romances circulating in at least 8 different languages. Monasteries that were supposed to be copying religious texts were secretly copying love stories. Noble families were commissioning personalized versions where the heroes resembled their own family members. But the real transformation happened when these literary ideas began influencing actual social behavior. The generation that grew up reading about passionate love began to demand those same choices in their own lives. The most documented example comes from the court records of 13th century England, where the number of young people refusing arranged marriages increased by over 400% between 1200 and 1250. Church officials complained that young men and women were using romantic literature to justify their disobedience to family authority. Bishop Robert Grosseteste of Lincoln wrote in 1240, "The young people of our time have been corrupted by tales of passionate love that teach them to value their own desires above their family's wisdom and God's plan for their lives. They speak of true love as if it were a virtue rather than a temptation." What the bishop didn't realize was that he was witnessing the birth of the modern concept of individual rights. The young people who refused arranged marriages weren't just being rebellious. They were asserting a revolutionary new idea that individual emotional fulfillment was a legitimate basis for major life decisions. This idea spread far beyond romantic relationships. If people could choose their own marriage partners based on personal feelings, why couldn't they choose their own religious beliefs, their own careers, their own political loyalties? The concept of individual choice that began with forbidden love stories gradually expanded to transform every aspect of European society. The influence on religious thought was particularly profound. Medieval theologians were forced to develop new theories about the relationship between human love and divine love. If passionate romantic relationships could inspire people to acts of extraordinary courage, devotion, and self-sacrifice, then perhaps human love was actually a reflection of God's love rather than a distraction from it. The most influential theologian of this movement was Peter Abelard. Yes, the same Abelard whose love affair with Heloise we discussed earlier. Abelard's theological writings argued that the capacity for passionate love was actually evidence of the divine spark within human beings. He claimed that people who could love deeply were more likely to understand God's love, not less. This theological revolution had massive practical implications. It provided intellectual justification for choosing love over duty, for following individual conscience over social convention, for believing that personal emotional experience could be a valid source of moral guidance. By the 14th century, these ideas had become so influential that they were changing the legal system itself. The concept of marriage by consent, the idea that both partners must freely agree to a marriage for it to be valid, became increasingly accepted throughout Europe, despite opposition from families and political authorities who preferred arranged marriages. The development of canon law began to reflect these changing attitudes. Church courts increasingly ruled in favor of couples who claimed to have married for love, even when those marriages violated family wishes or political agreements. The famous case of Richard de Montpaon and Isabella de Clare in 1285 established the legal precedent that marriages contracted from genuine affection cannot be dissolved by external authority. But perhaps the most lasting impact of these medieval love stories was on the development of vernacular literature. Before the 12th century, serious literature was written in Latin and focused on religious or classical themes. The forbidden love stories created demand for literature in local languages that dealt with contemporary emotional experiences. This literary revolution gave birth to the entire concept of national literatures. French literature, English literature, German literature, Italian literature. All of these traditions began with medieval writers trying to capture the emotional complexity of forbidden love in their own languages. Dante's Divine Comedy, often considered the greatest work of medieval literature, is fundamentally a love story about the author's impossible passion for Beatrice. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales are filled with characters struggling between duty and desire. The entire tradition of European poetry emerged from medieval attempts to express the indescribable experience of forbidden love. The influence extended far beyond literature into the visual arts, music, and architecture. The Gothic cathedrals of the 12th and 13th centuries, with their soaring vertical lines and ethereal light effects, were designed to evoke the same sense of spiritual transcendence that people experienced in passionate love. The rose windows, flying buttresses, and elaborate stone carvings all reflected the medieval belief that earthly beauty could be a pathway to divine understanding. Medieval music theory was revolutionized by composers trying to capture the emotional complexity of forbidden relationships. The development of polyphony, harmony, and complex rhythmic structures all emerged from attempts to create musical equivalents of the emotional experiences described in love literature. Even medieval philosophy was transformed by the need to understand and justify these powerful emotional experiences. The development of scholastic philosophy, with its emphasis on the compatibility of reason and emotion, human experience and divine truth, was directly influenced by the need to create intellectual frameworks that could accommodate passionate love. What's most remarkable is how these medieval innovations created the intellectual foundation for the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and ultimately the modern world. The idea that individual experience matters, that personal choice is valuable, that emotional fulfillment is a legitimate goal. These concepts that we now consider fundamental to human rights and democratic society all began with medieval people who were willing to risk everything for forbidden love. The modern concepts of romantic love, individual rights, personal autonomy, and emotional authenticity are not ancient human universals. They are specific historical developments that emerged from the courage of medieval people who chose love over safety, passion over convention, individual desire over social control. And that brings us to the final question that these medieval love stories raise. What can we learn from people who were willing to risk everything for love? What do their choices teach us about our own lives, our own relationships, and our own willingness to fight for what we believe in? Because the medieval period may be over, but the choice between safety and authenticity, between convention and passion, between following your heart and following the rules, that choice is still with us today. And as we reach the end of our journey through these forbidden medieval love stories, I want to share something that struck me deeply while researching these incredible people. Every single one of them, from Heloise writing love letters in a convent to Eleanor of Aquitaine leading armies, from peasants sending coded messages through sheep to kings risking their kingdoms for love, faced the same fundamental question that we face today. Will you choose the life that's expected of you, or will you choose the life that's true to who you really are? The medieval lovers we've met tonight didn't have the luxury of living in a time when individual choice was celebrated. They didn't have dating apps or divorce lawyers or social media support groups. They lived in a world where loving the wrong person could literally cost them everything. And yet they chose love anyway, not because it was easy, but because it was real. What I find most inspiring about these stories is that they reveal something profound about human nature. When love is authentic, when connection is genuine, when two souls truly recognize each other, people will move mountains to protect that bond. They'll invent new languages, create secret codes, challenge kings, defy the church, and even face death itself, rather than live without what they know to be true. Heloise and Abelard taught us that intellectual connection can be just as passionate as physical attraction, and that true love can survive any separation, even castration, forced religious vows, and decades of physical distance. Their love letters, written from behind monastery walls, were more intimate and passionate than most people achieve when they're free to be together every day. Eleanor of Aquitaine showed us that love and power don't have to be mutually exclusive. She proved that you can be romantic and strategic, vulnerable and strong, passionate and political. She refused to accept that being a queen meant giving up her right to choose her own emotional destiny. The Troubadours and their secret codes taught us that creativity flourishes when love is challenged. When society tries to silence authentic emotion, people don't become less expressive. They become more ingenious. Some of the most beautiful art, music, and literature in human history was created by people who were finding ways to say, "I love you," when saying those words out loud was forbidden. The cross-class lovers showed us that genuine connection transcends all artificial barriers. When Lady Margaret de Clare looked at her groom and saw not his social status but his soul, she was making a choice that still challenges us today. Will you judge people by their circumstances, or will you recognize their intrinsic worth? The interfaith couples who loved across religious boundaries proved that the human heart recognizes no authority higher than authentic connection. Diego and Zaida, Robert and Kerboga, Abraham and Maria. They all discovered that love has its own theology, its own moral authority, its own spiritual truth that transcends the divisions that institutions try to create between people. The same-sex couples who found ways to love within impossible constraints showed us that when something is essential to who you are, you will find a way to express it. No matter how hostile the environment, their creativity, their courage, and their refusal to deny their authentic selves paved the way for every person who has ever had to fight for the right to love openly. The royal couples who chose love over political convenience taught us about the true cost of authenticity. Philip Augustus was willing to let all of France suffer under papal interdict rather than give up Agnes. Pedro the Cruel started a civil war rather than abandon Maria. They paid terrible prices for their choices, but they also showed us what it looks like to refuse to compromise on what matters most. And all those creative communicators, from Guillaume de Machaut encoding love songs in musical cryptography to peasants training sheep to carry messages, prove that when love is real, people become infinitely resourceful. They'll turn gardens into love letters, transform religious manuscripts into secret romantic novels, and invent entirely new forms of artistic expression just to say, "I see you, I choose you, and I will find a way to reach you." But here's what I think is the most important lesson from all these medieval love stories. They show us that the choice to live authentically is not a one-time decision. It's a choice you have to make again and again, sometimes every single day. These medieval lovers didn't just choose love once and then coast. They chose it repeatedly in the face of constant pressure to conform, to give up, to accept what was safe and expected. Marguerite d'Avar chose love every day for 37 years while imprisoned in a convent, spending her time recreating her lover's songs from memory. Benedetta Carlini chose love every time for a decade, maintaining her relationship through elaborate theological justifications that protected both her and Bartolomea. The Sworn brothers chose love in their daily ceremonies, their shared meals, their joint burial plans. These people teach us that authentic love, whether romantic, spiritual, or intellectual, requires constant courage. It's not enough to recognize what's true for you once. You have to keep choosing it, keep protecting it, keep nurturing it, even when the world makes it difficult. And that brings me to why I think these medieval love stories matter so much today. We live in a time when we're told we have unlimited freedom to choose our own lives, our own partners, our own destinies. But do we really? How many of us are still choosing safety over authenticity? How many are still letting other people's expectations shape our most important decisions? How many are still hiding our true selves because we're afraid of what others might think? The medieval lovers we've met tonight didn't have the freedoms we have, but they had something that many of us have lost: absolute clarity about what mattered most to them. They knew that living an inauthentic life was a form of spiritual death, and they chose the risks of authenticity over the safety of conformity. Their stories ask us difficult questions. If you knew that following your heart might cost you everything, would you do it anyway? If you had to choose between being safe and being true to yourself, which would you choose? If love required you to be brave in ways you've never been brave before, would you find that courage? These aren't just historical questions, they're personal ones. Because the medieval period may be over, but the fundamental choice between authenticity and conformity is still with us. The stakes may be different, but the courage required is the same. What would it look like to bring the same passion, creativity, and determination that medieval lovers brought to their impossible relationships into our own lives? What would it look like to fight for our authentic selves with the same intensity that Heloise fought for her intellectual freedom? Or Eleanor fought for her political autonomy, or those anonymous peasants fought for their right to love across class boundaries? I think it would look like revolution. Not the kind that overthrows governments, but the kind that overthrows the internal limitations we've accepted, the compromises we've made, the ways we've learned to make ourselves smaller to fit into spaces that were never designed for our full selves. The medieval lovers we've met tonight were revolutionaries. They didn't set out to change the world. They just refused to let the world change them. But by staying true to themselves, by choosing love over fear, by insisting on their right to authentic connection, they ended up transforming everything. They created the foundation for our modern understanding of individual rights, personal choice, and the value of emotional authenticity. The revolution isn't finished. Every time someone chooses love over fear, authenticity over safety, genuine connection over social convenience, they're continuing the work that started in those medieval monasteries, courts, and secret meeting places. Every time someone refuses to let others choose their heart for them, they're honoring the courage of people who paid much higher prices for much smaller freedoms. So, as we close this journey through medieval forbidden love, I want to leave you with this. You are the inheritor of an incredible legacy of courage. The freedom you have to choose your own relationships, to follow your own heart, to live according to your own values, these freedoms were bought with the sacrifices of people who chose authenticity when it cost them everything. Don't waste that legacy. Don't settle for relationships that don't honor your full self. Don't accept limitations that others have placed on your capacity for love, creativity, or joy. Don't let fear make your choices for you. Choose love even when it's complicated. Choose authenticity even when it's inconvenient. Choose the connections that make you feel most like yourself, even when they don't make sense to others. Choose the life that makes your heart sing, even when it makes your mind worry. The medieval lovers we've met tonight didn't have the advantages you have, but they had something precious that they passed down to you. The knowledge that love is always worth fighting for, that authenticity is always worth the risk, and that the courage to be yourself is the most revolutionary act of all. Thank you for taking this incredible journey with me through the hidden love stories of medieval Europe. These tales of passion, courage, and authenticity have been waiting for centuries to remind us what it means to truly choose love over fear. I hope these stories have moved you as much as they've moved me. I hope they've reminded you that you have more courage than you know, more freedom than you realize, and more capacity for authentic love than you might have imagined. Next time, we're going to explore another chapter of hidden history that will completely change how you see the world. Until then, remember the courage of those medieval lovers, honor the legacy of their choices, and most importantly, choose love. Always choose love, sweet dreams, and may your own love story be worthy of the brave souls who came before us.